thank you for that introduction. And before I get into what I'm going to talk to you about, I want to say thanks also to all the people who serve as poll watchers and as election officials. Look, I've been involved in elections since I was a poll watcher for the first time in the early 1990s in Atlanta. And I can tell you, you're vital to ensuring the integrity of the election process. That is so important. And yes, I did serve on the election board here in Fairfax County 10 years ago during the Obama administration. Chris, you have my sympathy. And I'll tell you two quick stories about this. First of all, you know, in Virginia, like most other states, the law says that you're supposed to have a Republican and a Democrat in each polling place, right? Yeah. When I was on the election board for 3 years, the Democrats always had more people than they needed for the precincts, and the Republicans never had enough. And of course, when that happens, what ends up, well, you end up with people from the same party running the polling place. So there's no one there to make sure that they're actually following the law. Two quick poll watcher stories. And this is what got me into elections full time. I was a lawyer in Atlanta. I got talked into being a poll watcher by the local Republican Party chairman. He basically had to twist my arm to do it. And I said, okay, I'll do it. This was a local county commission race. And I, at that time, was a lot younger. And I was assigned to one of the worst precincts in Atlanta. Okay? The GOP women, who, as many of you know, are the backbone of grassroots work in this area, did not want to be in this precinct. So I ended up going there. And I walk into this precinct. It's 95% Democratic district precinct. And when people are going up to the registration desk to give their name and check in, the people behind the desk are saying, well, are you a Republican or a Democrat? They were trying to intimidate the few Republicans there from not voting. And I was a poll watcher. I called up, you know, the hotline and said, this is going on. They called the county registrar. The county registrar sent somebody down there, and they stopped it from happening. And that's why, listen, if you're a poll watcher and absolutely nothing happens and you're bored, that's a good thing. Right? Second quick story, in which I was also peripherally involved in, is remember, in the 2008 election, when Barack Obama got elected, you all recall there was a lot of news about the fact that members of the new Black Panther Party were standing outside a precinct in Philadelphia in paramilitary outfits, yelling racial epithets at white voters and white poll watchers going in. The only reason we know about that is because a young college student had volunteered to be a poll watcher, and he saw it happening and got out his iPhone and recorded it. Okay, and that's the only reason we know about it. That led to a lawsuit filed by the Bush administration right as they were leaving, right, just a couple of weeks before Barack Obama came in, charging them with intimidation, etc. And of course, you know what happened when the Obama administration came in. They dropped the suit. Okay, but that tells you the importance of all of this. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we have mass election fraud all over the country in every election. I mean, that's not true. But we have enough of it that we should be concerned about it. And the Supreme Court itself said that in 2008 when Indiana, remember, had passed one of the first photo ID laws in the country. The ACLU and others sued, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the ACLU and others were arguing there's no election fraud in the U.S. There's no need for a voter ID law. And the Supreme Court upheld it, so that's perfectly constitutional. It is not a burden on voters. And it said the U.S. has a long history of election fraud. It's been documented by journalists and historians, and it can make the difference in a close election. And that, of course, is the key to this. We have close elections all the time in this country. How many years ago was it twice in this state that we had a statewide attorney general's race decided by less than 1,000 votes? In fact, less than 300 votes in one race. It was just a couple of years ago that the control of the state house came down to one race where they tied, and remember they pulled a name out of a bowl to decide, and the Republican won. By the way, that's the same that district is the same district where another organization, as you all heard, I work for the Heritage Foundation, but I'm also on the board of another organization called the Public Interest Legal Foundation. And they had done something very interesting. They had used the motor voter law to go to county registrars all over the state. They had to sue some of them to force them to comply, and said, we want the files of every registered voter who sends you a letter saying, please take me off the voter rolls because I am not a U.S. citizen. Wow. They issued a report on this. It's available on their website. They found 5,500 individuals who said, I'm not a U.S. citizen, take me off. Not before they had cast about 7,500 ballots. The ballots that the county that had that one district with the tied race, I think they had several hundred non-citizens. So that could have made a difference in that race. Judy Flagg, who's here. Judy, where are you in the audience? Is she here? There she is. Judy Flagg worked for, she was one of the good people who worked for the county election department when I was on the board. And she could tell you that when I was on the board, we did something for the first time, was we started checking the DMV list for non-citizens. And we discovered several hundred non-citizens were registered to vote in Fairfax County. How did we know? Because when they went and got their driver's license, they presented documentation that they were not U.S. citizens. Now, they were here legally, but in every single state across the United States, if you're here legally, you can get a driver's license. And in about 12.5 states, you can get one if you're here illegally. Now, we took them off the board, off the registration list. And then, with the no vote, we were able to override the no vote of the Democratic members. We had 2 Republicans, which you don't have yet. We sent the information on all these aliens to both the Commonwealth's attorney, who's a Democrat, and to the Obama Justice Department. And of course, as you know, they did absolutely nothing about it. Now, if you want to know how much fraud occurs, we don't know the answer to that. And the left doesn't want us to know the answer to that. Because you all heard, I got appointed to the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity by President Trump in 2017. We were only in operation for like 3 months. And we're unable to accomplish a single thing. Now, you wouldn't know that from reading any media report, whether it's the Washington Post or anywhere else. What they'll always say is, oh, he had this commission, they found no voter fraud. That is absolutely false. What happened was we weren't allowed to operate to even look at the problem. Remember, an presidential advisory commission, it has no executive power. All I can do is study a problem and make recommendations. The left went berserk over this commission because one of the things that we wanted to do was to obtain the statewide voter registration lists from every single state and then start comparing them. Find out how many people are there who are perhaps registered in more than one state, voting in more than one state. We wanted to run it by the Department of Homeland Security records to find aliens who are illegally registered. We wanted to run it by the Social Security Master Death Index to find out how many people are dead who were on the list. The left was so upset about this that they filed 12 lawsuits to stop it from operating. And unfortunately, they were successful because this lean staff that this commission had were spending all of their time working with the Justice Department to answer these lawsuits. Plus, all these governors across the country, including Terry McAuliffe, said, we are not providing you with that voter registration list. Now, keep in mind that Virginia will sell it to any candidate or political party or others, but they weren't going to give it to this presidential commission. So we never actually got to do the work. However, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, which is the group I was telling you about earlier, that I'm on the board of, the president of, I'm on the board, the president is Christian Adams. Some of you guys have probably seen on Fox a lot. And he was on the commission with me. And we said, you know, why don't we do that? Okay, so we obtained the voter registration files from 42 states. Had to sue a bunch of them together. Cost a lot of money. And we got the voter histories also. Then we hired, and again, this cost a lot of money. Voter registration lists, as you know, in this country are in terrible shape. And a lot of them are very incomplete with the data. So we hired somebody who then went to do something, and he used something that states don't use and ought to, which is commercial databases, credit agencies. Why? Because credit agencies, you guys will be scared at how much information they have about each of you. Okay, and their information is much more up to date and much more accurate than government databases. The point of this was that we were able to obtain unique identifiers on every single registered voter in every state. Full social security numbers. That meant that we could, if we were comparing data between Virginia and Maryland, we would know whether the John Smith, born on a particular date, was the same John Smith registered in both states or not. Why? Because we had the full Social Security number. We had information from the 2016 and 2018 elections. We found over 144,000 cases of potential fraud. This consisted of something like 14,000 individuals who were registered in 2 different states and had voted in 2 different states. We found thousands of people who were registered in the same state, at the same address, but with just slight discrepancies in their name. Because election officials just aren't very good at finding them. I can just about guarantee you that in some states, if I went in and registered as Hans von Spakovsky, and then if I registered again as Hans, middle initial A, von Spakovsky, they would consider it as 2 different registrations. Anyway, we found thousands of people who were registered twice, same person, and they voted twice. We also found, I think it was 14,000 people who in the 2016 and 2018 elections were credited by state election officials with having voted after they were dead. Okay? And the other thing we found was something like 35,000 people who voted, who were registered not at the residential address where you're supposed to be registered under the law, but at commercial addresses, at county parks, basketball courts, vacant lots. Now, this report came out, we released a report on this, it's called Critical Conditions, available on the Public Interest Legal Foundation website. We released this report prior to the 2020 election, 42 states. Do you think that a single election official in any state called the Public Interest Legal Foundation and said, send us the individual information on the voters in our state who your comparisons show voted twice so we can investigate? Not a single one. Not a single law enforcement official in any state, and no one at the U.S. Department of Justice called saying, send us the information so that we can investigate and potentially prosecute. No one. I tell you that because that was 144,000 cases of potential fraud that no one had any interest in investigating or potentially prosecuting. And that shows you one of the biggest problems in this area. A couple of years ago, as many of you know, the Heritage Foundation where I work, we started an election fraud database. Now, we only put proven cases of fraud in. In other words, we wait until somebody's been convicted in a court of law or a judge has ordered a new election, and then we put it into the case. You can go to our website, click on any state, it'll bring up the list. We're up to 1,340 cases, proven cases, and we're following probably 24 other cases. The left now has gone, and the media too, has gone from saying, well, there's no election fraud, to saying, oh, look at the heritage fraud database. There's hardly any. But our database would be a heck of a lot bigger if law enforcement and election officials were actually interested in investigating, for example, 144,000 cases. If those cases have been followed, our database, instead of being 1,300 cases, might be 130,000 cases. This was proven to me how non-interested the media these days is in this by two things. One that just happened yesterday, I think. Okay? Prior to the 2020 election, USA Today, PBS Frontline, and the Columbia School of Journalism assigned 14 reporters not to investigate potential claims of fraud or anything like that, but to investigate our database. They literally combed through the entire thing looking for mistakes and errors. They didn't find any. But that was their interest in doing that. A second example of how they just don't want to talk about this. If anybody reads the Washington Post, you'll see there was an article yesterday. Well, thank you. I have to admit, I do read the comment section. They just had an article about a proposal that Governor DeSantis has made. It's a great idea. Okay, he has proposed to his legislature that they set up a statewide office whose only job it will be to investigate and prosecute election fraud. Okay? Now, the reporter from the Washington Post called me about this because, of course, folks on the left are saying there's no need for this, there's no fraud, you don't need to worry about it. So I said to her, well, look, one of the biggest problems in these areas is prosecutors just aren't interested in prosecuting these cases. And I said, if you want an example of this in Florida, go to the website of, again, the Public Interest Legal Foundation. Because they have another report on there. We released it in November. It's called Safe Harbor. And here's what we did. Florida has one of the best open records laws of any state in the country. Okay? It's really good. So we sent a request to county election officials in Florida saying, we want information on any criminal referrals arising out of the 2020 election that you sent to local prosecutors. Now, having been an election official, I can tell you that for an election official to actually refer a case to the local DA, they don't do it until they've got solid evidence. Because they're so scared of being charged that they're trying to suppress votes, etc. And we discovered that something like a dozen counties had sent 156 criminal referrals arising out of the 2020 election to local prosecutors. Now, PILF then checked with the DA's offices, they checked the court records to see what had been done with these criminal referrals. And would anyone like to guess how many of them were actually investigated and prosecuted by the local DAs? Zero. Exactly right. I told this reporter about this, and I said, look, this shows the need to have a statewide office that will actually investigate and prosecute these cases. You can pull up the story and read it. There is absolutely no mention in the story of those 156 cases. And that shows you how they just aren't interested in this. My point here is, again, fraud can make a difference in close elections, and we have close elections all the time. And a quick example of this, which I haven't seen a lot of coverage of, is about 3 months ago, the district attorney in Los Angeles indicted, criminally charged, 6 individuals in Compton, California, including a member of the city council. They're charged with two things: absentee ballot fraud and voter registration fraud. The voter registration fraud is because several of the individuals charged, they don't actually live in Compton. Instead, they registered to vote at the home of the candidate, one of the candidates for city council, and a member of the city council. The city council member who was charged, do you know what the margin of victory was in his city council election where the fraud occurred? 1 vote. Okay, and that's a graphic example of what I'm talking about. Now, what do we do about this? Well, there's a lot of recommendations in our new book, Our Broken Elections. But here's something that we hope will be a big help to state legislators and to folks like all of you, okay? A year ago, January, frankly, we were having a meeting at the legal center where I work at Heritage, and somebody was saying, well, you know, what's the status of election integrity in all these different states? And we're going, well, you know, nobody's actually looked at that. So we came up with what we consider to be best practices standards for running an election that is secure, that protects voters, where everybody who's eligible has access, and you're trying to protect the integrity of the election process. We came up with 12 different categories covering absentee ballots and how they should be handled, how voter registration lists should be cleaned up, and a whole series of other ones. And within those 12 broad categories, we came up with 47 different standards. We then did a very long, complicated task of analyzing the laws of every state on these issues. And a month ago, mid-December, we released what's called the Election Integrity Scorecard. Okay, I handed out some pamphlets on, have a website. It analyzes every single state based on whether their laws meet our best practices standards, and a perfect score would be 100. No state in the country got 100. And as you might expect, the best states in the country tend to be in the Southeast, whereas the worst states in the country tend to be places like California and New York. All right? Virginia is ranked 16th in the country, which might sound good, except that its score was 65. Okay, it's been a while since our kids were in K through 12. Is that an F? Or is that a D-minus? It's an F.
That's an A now in Thomas Jefferson.
You can go to the Heritage webpage, Election Integrity Scorecard, and you can pull up Virginia, and we break down every single issue and why they got points for it or why they didn't. And to give you an example, we assign 20 points to whether a state has a photo ID requirement for voting. That is a vital requirement. As you know, Virginia had one. When the Democrats took control, they got rid of it. In fact, they put in an affidavit exemption, you know, to show up a polling place and have an ID. Just fill out a form saying, yeah, I'm really Bill Clinton, and they'll let you vote. One of the reasons Virginia scored badly was because they no longer have an ID requirement like that. They also scored badly because we have a whole series of things that need to be done to maintain the accuracy of a voter rolls. Some of them need legislative authorizations, but others just need the election officials to just do it. Okay, and let me give you a quick example of this. When a voter registration form comes in, remember, in this state, like every state, you've got to be registered at where you live, right? The residential address, okay? All right, well, what's the most important objective of county governments, not only in Virginia but everywhere else. It's collecting property taxes, right? Because that's how they fund everything. What that means is that the county tax department knows every piece of property in the county. They know what's there. They know whether it's a single-family home, an apartment, a condo, a commercial address. They know whether it's a vacant lot because they're calculating what the tax is and whether it's due. Every election official in this state, in every county, when a form comes in with a newly registered voter, ought to be calling up the county tax department and saying, okay, we've got this address. What is it? Is it a residential address? Because if they come back and say, well, actually it's a vacant lot, then they need to immediately red flag it and say, we're going to have to investigate this and see if it's fraud. They're not doing that. Okay? Not only that, but if the county tax department comes back and says, well, yeah, it's a residential property, well, the next question should be, well, is it a single-family home? And if they say yes, then what should the county registrar be doing? He pulls up the entire registration list and finds out how many people are registered at that single-family home. Because if there are 50 people registered at that single-family home, then there's clearly a problem. Okay, those are simple things that ought to be happening, and they are not. Another simple thing that ought to be happening that isn't in this state is we have electronic poll books, right? Okay. Well, why isn't the state pulling the photograph that is in your DMV file and putting it next to your name in the electronic poll book? So that when you walk in, they can quickly look at the photo and make sure that it's you. Now, if you want a good example of why this is a good idea, let me tell you a quick story, which is true. You can Google this. New York, as you know, is one of the states that has no ID requirement of any kind. And in 2013, when de Blasio was first elected, the New York Department of Investigations had gotten all these complaints that the city was not maintaining the accuracy of its voter rolls, and that the people on the county city election board were hiring their family, which is fairly illegal in New York. You're not supposed to do that. So on election day, when de Blasio was running, this investigations department sent in their undercover people in precincts all over the city and told them that ask for ballots in the names of folks that they had checked the list. And they found people who were dead who shouldn't be on the list. They found people who had moved and shouldn't be on the list. And they tried to make it as obvious as possible for the registrars to figure out the problem. For example, one of their undercover agents was a young African-American woman, and she went in and asked for the ballot of a Caucasian woman in her late 80s who was dead. Every single one of the undercover folks was given a ballot, with one exception. The one exception was one of the undercover agents went into a precinct to ask for the ballot of a registered voter who was in the state penitentiary. And they obviously could not vote. And he was caught because it turned out that the woman working at the registration desk was the prisoner's mother. But that's the point of not having an ID. Okay? And that's one of the reasons, for example, with poll books. Again, this is simple. They just pull the photo from the DMV file and put it in there, and the state is not doing that. Now, there's a whole series of other things that are going to need state authorization that we score states on. And one of them is related to the discussion earlier about what the Fairfax County Registrar was doing. Okay, remember, right before the election, the county registrar announced that he just wasn't going to abide by the state law that says when you request an absentee ballot, in addition to name and so forth, you have to provide the last 4 digits of your social security number. And he said, well, I'm just not going to do that. Now, I'm sure all of you realize a county election official has no authority to waive a requirement of state law. Okay? A lawsuit was filed, and the judge, I think his name was Devine, he's a former public defender. Okay? He threw the case out because he said the voters didn't have standing to sue. Now, if a voter doesn't have standing to sue an election official who's refusing to comply with the law, I mean, I don't know who would. But the point of this is one of our standards, the greatest state, is the state needs a law that gives voters standing to sue any election official who's refusing to enforce the law. That's the standard requirement. Now, two warnings about the database. I'm sorry, the scorecard. One, it is not an analysis of the 2020 election, okay? It is a status of the laws in every state as of December, a month ago. And remember what happened in last year's legislative sessions. A lot of states passed good reforms. Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Iowa. In fact, I hope y'all didn't have to do this. I get paid to do it, even so it was excruciating. I had to watch Joe Biden's speech in the as you know, they were complaining about the fact that 19 states passed all these horrible laws, these horrible election reform laws, but that's, none of them suppress those. None of them do the things they claim to do. But my point of the only truth in that story is that 19 states actually passed good reforms. So those are included in our analysis. The other thing to keep in mind is that and there's no way to come up with objective criteria for this, so we didn't do it. Look, what we're analyzing is the laws in every state and the regulations. You can have the best laws and the best regulations in the world, but if officials don't comply with them and don't enforce them, they're worthless. And that has been a problem in places like Pennsylvania and elsewhere. The way I hope this scorecard gets used is the way it was used last night in Alaska. Last night, a Senate State Committee, it's the State Affairs Committee in Alaska, held a hearing. And I was invited to be, as a virtual hearing, I did not go to Alaska for it. I was invited to be a potential witness at the hearing. The only witness was the state director of elections. And you know what the state senators did? They had a copy of our scorecard for Alaska. Alaska was ranked much worse than Virginia. And they just went through the scorecard, and every place that the state got a 0, they said to the director of elections, why aren't you doing this? Okay, and that's what we're hoping will happen in every state, including places like here. Now, I'll end with this, which is, I'm sure when Christine and Steve Osmond, when they set this meeting up, they didn't realize that right now, the future fate of the security of elections is being argued in the United States Senate. Because as you know, what has been going on for the past year is Democrats put together several election bills. Includes HR 1, another bill they call the Freedom to Vote Act. It really should be called the Freedom to Cheat Act. And the third one is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Those bills have passed the House. Republicans have done a terrific job of successfully filibustering it in the Senate. Those bills are the most dangerous bills I have ever seen affecting elections. And if they pass, we would be in very big trouble. I won't go into all the details of them except to say that this is one of the most important fights of our lifetime, is stopping these bills. Because they not only would lead to a federal takeover and micromanagement of the election process, but they would put in all kinds of horribles. Every voter ID law in the country would be gutted. If you require a witness signature on an absentee ballot, you can't do that anymore. It would force in what Virginia is unfortunately going to get unless Republicans can reverse the bill, which is same-day voter registration, which of course gives election officials no opportunity to actually verify any of the information. And if you combine that with not having a voter ID, I could go from one polling place to another in Fairfax, make up a name, make up an address. They have to let me register, they have to let me vote. And even if you as an election official are suspicious, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't ask me for an ID. Also, by the way, it has a provision, I'm sure you guys will love this. It has a public funding program for congressional candidates. So your taxpayer money would be used to subsidize congressional campaigns. The congressional campaigns of people who you would never vote for. And I can't think of anything that's a greater violation of your First Amendment rights than that. Anyway, hopefully that will be stopped. But then the other big thing that's got to happen is more reforms in Virginia. It's going to be a very tough fight when you only control one house. And we may not be able to stop things like same-day voter registration. But our scorecard gives you the information you need. The scorecard gives you the information you need to work on this. And remember, while some of these things need legislative authorization, other things don't. Other things just need getting the county registrar to start doing the jobs that they ought to be doing on all these different issues. So that's all I was going to tell you.